Welcome to this episode of Unraveling Adoption, an intentional space to delve into adoption's complexities together. I'm Beth Syverson, an adoptive mom of a vibrant and insightful 19-year-old son, Joey, who is struggling to find his path. I'm walking beside him while working on my own personal growth and healing. We are committed to helping anyone touched by adoption, and we want to help the general public understand adoption's complexities better too. Today's guest is Michael Grenfell, all the way from Sydney, Australia. He's a domestic adoptee from the baby scoop era, born in 1971. He always knew he was going to search for his birth family from a very young age. And now he is an advocate pushing for more transparency in adoption, especially now with the existence of DNA testing. Michael is an author of poetry, crime fiction, and he's working on his memoir. While we learn about Michael's story and the roller coaster ride of his adopted life, we will focus on how important fathers have been for him, both his adoptive and natural fathers. We usually talk much more about birth mothers in adoption land, but today we're going to consider the male side of the equation. And I also want to hear a bit about what's happening in Australia with adoption as well. So welcome to Unraveling Adoption all the way from Australia, Michael. Glad you're here.
Hi, Beth. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Well, so let's walk through your life, the main points of it. And I know your story is very complicated, filled with lots of twists and turns, but I want everyone to find out what your story was. So just start with your earliest years. What happened to you as an infant?
Sure. I was born in 71 in the suburb of Sydney, Camperdown. And like many of us, we come to our adoption by either finding out by someone telling us or by finding paperwork in a parent's drawer, bedroom, desk, or whatever the case may be. Mm-hmm. I always knew I was adopted. I wasn't exactly sure what that particularly meant in some respects, but I do have a couple of key memories as a child in primary school, and one was a class task of doing a family tree.
Oh, the dreaded family tree.
Yeah, and I remember saying to the teacher, oh, well, who's your mother, who's your father? And I said, well, I'm adopted. And I remember she got angry and said, well, just do your mother now. But for me at that moment, at sort of 5 or 6 years of age, I then recognised that there was two mothers. Mm-hmm. And there was the one that I was living with and taking me to school and looking after me, and there was this other mother. Then, okay, well, where is she and who is she? So that sort of cemented that recognition of that difference and sense of loss, because in relation to all my friends, it's like, well, who's your real mother? Your mother didn't want you. She gave you away and all this sort of stuff. So
that's so painful.
Yeah, I learned from other people's responses what actually adoption was to a certain degree. It was very confusing because I then felt that I couldn't ask the question why or how or who was a little bit bigger and beyond me.
Did you try to ask your adoptive parents?
I don't recall.
Okay. You kind of sensed maybe that it was an off-limits topic?
I believe so, yeah. I don't believe it was something that would be open to discussion.
And how old were you when you were adopted?
I was adopted at 3.5 years of age. I spent the first 5.5 months of my life in an institution. I was very sick. That was one factor. I was fostered at 5.5 months and then later adopted by the same couple at 3.5 years of age.
Okay. So they fostered to adopt. We kind of do that here sometimes. They weren't sure if it would come through, but it did come through.
That's correct. Okay. Yeah, there was a delay in my adoption, and what I've been told is I was what's called a deferred adoption. Mm-hmm. The reason being is I was 3 months premature in 1971.
Oof.
Yeah, and I was about 2.5 pounds, so I was extremely underweight, had to be intubated, put in a humidicrib, that type of thing, and multiple life-saving operations in that first 3 months of my life. So it was very, very touch and go. So the deferred adoption, the way that operates or operated in Australia is that one, if the child was believed to be impaired or if the mother was impaired or they believed that there was going to be some mental disability, and that was sort of the case for me. And that was only relayed to me many, many years later in an argument with my adoptive father saying, well,
oh, ouch.
we never thought anything would come of you. We always thought you were going to be retarded.
Wow.
So what I mentioned before is the process of finding information as we go.
Mm-hmm.
And then when we find that new information, I think this is something important that the general population don't understand. When we receive or find new information, we have to then reorient ourselves with that information, with a new foundation or a new guideposts or whatever you want to call them. So it's deep identity structure stuff that we're continually renegotiating all the time throughout this journey.
Yeah, it's no small thing getting a new piece of information about your existence, right?
Yeah.
Your history. It's no small thing, and it can really be destabilizing. And it sounds like, especially your dad, maybe you could tell me what your mom was like, but it sounds like your dad was not sensitive, nurturing type.
He was a pretty typical male of the era of going to work and coming home, and it was the mother who looked after the children and looked after the house. So there's very much a division of that labour. I recognise now as a father and my age and my understanding also being a step-parent, the difficulty in the reality of basically bringing up a child that doesn't have any genetic reflection. So you've got that genetic bewilderment that adoptees suffer. I believe very much also the adoptive parents also suffer that because they don't get that reflection back to them.
Yeah.
But the way the child works, the way the child walks, talks, operates, and whatever the case may be. So the old blank slate theory, of course, that's now thrown out the window. We come to this with a collection of inherited behaviours and capacities already internalised.
Yeah, for sure. As an adoptive parent, I can say, yeah, it's hard to grasp or find that piece, but there is a grief that my kid doesn't look like me. And my son for sure did not act like me. I was the kind that would sit on my mom's lap all day long and read a book. And he was like a little hurricane running around everywhere. He was very active and very athletic. I'm like, who is this? Now, it could be I could have had an athletic kid of my own too, but there is a disconnect there for adoptive parents that if you really dig deep, that's in there. And for sure, I can imagine as an adoptee, because you had no choice in this matter, you're just in this situation where you don't look or act like anyone.
Yeah, my thoughts or feelings is that as children, we all obviously look to our parents and caregivers of how we are in the world.
Yeah.
And that I recognised at a very early age that I was different to them. I internalised that difference as being a problem with me.
Yeah, I think most people do that. It's just the natural thing. Well, I guess everyone else can't be wrong. It's got to just be me. And that's so damaging. Have you had lasting effects of that through your life that you can pinpoint to that kind of identity crisis? How did that play out for you?
It changed once again when I had my own children. And it was more of a recognition of that difference and the degree of that difference throughout my life. So you deal with it and you manage it as best you can. But once I had my own children, looking at a child that looks like me is just absolutely out of this world. It was amazing and terrifying all at the same instance because I recognised then also that lack that I have. Also in relation to that, I knew what my mother looked like from about 25, 30 years of age, but I never knew what my father, I normally say mother for the mother who gave birth to me. I normally say my mum for my adoptive mum. I normally say dad for my adoptive dad. And I normally say father for my biological father. So I should have clarified that.
That makes sense.
Then when I finally saw a picture of my biological father, because it was a picture of him as an older man, I didn't see me as an older man in the first instance within that picture that I saw before me. But it was only when I saw a picture of him younger that I then saw a carbon copy of myself and I collapsed.
Really?
Yeah. It's very, very difficult to describe. I had a feeling and a drop in my stomach and I collapsed, recognising that similarity, even though my daughters look very, very similar to me, but I never had a male similar.
Okay. So you had a couple of biological daughters.
Yes.
And a couple of stepchildren too?
1 step and 2 biological. Yep.
Okay. So you kind of have lots of different ways of dealing with parenting and the mirroring. You've got it both ways. Because your stepchild won't look like you, but certainly it's part of your family. Interesting. And then in the intro, I said that you wanted to search for your birth family since you were really little. And how did that go?
I always knew I wanted to search. What my thought was is, okay, there's something dreadful must have happened that for a mother or a father not be able to bring up a child or look after a child or whatever the case may be.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I always knew I was going to search, but it wasn't anything ever that was ever discussed with my adoptive parents. And unfortunately, the majority of this, there was never much of a discussion. Normally, it was part of an argument of some sort.
Oh, so anytime adoption came around, it was a fight?
But every time there was an argument, adoption was thrown in the mix. Why can't you be like this?
Oh, so you could be arguing about something else,
That's
and then
right.
they threw that in your face.
Exactly.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, that's painful.
Yeah. So the main issue there was trust. So there wasn't that trust there to be vulnerable, to ask what my needs were.
Yeah. So you waited till you were an adult or till they were gone? Or?
Yeah, I waited till no longer living at home with my parents.
Yeah, independent.
So when I first contacted the department and got my what's called non-identifying information, so that was a copy of original birth certificate and information in relation to my mother and father. And I'm guessing that's around about the early 1990s.
Okay, so you were in your 20s.
Yeah. So it sort of took a very, very long while for me to process the information.
I bet.
I have a recollection. I think I was around 8 years old, looked into filing cabinet at home and found adoption papers. And I was looking at this document with this other name. And I also have a younger adoptive sister. She was adopted from another family as well.
Okay.
Her journey is very different to mine, mind you. But then I saw this name and I thought, well, who's this other boy? Because I was so young, I didn't understand. And I said to my parents, well, did you adopt someone else? Who's this other boy? What's his name? This Brian? And they go, well, that's you. So, well, what do you mean? My name's Michael. Well, we changed your name.
Oh, wow.
So in my mind, that led to a lot of mistrust because my name was changed. So I haven't had a clear resolution of that because I was fostered in the first instance and then adopted. Well, when did they actually change my name and when did they actually start calling me by my new name? So we'd all recognise that a 3.5-year-old child is going to know what their name is and respond to their name.
Yeah.
So in my mind, then to change that child's name to something totally different that's just not on. And that was the case. That's what happened there. So that was something which I've struggled with.
Did they tell you why they changed it?
I don't recall.
They just wanted it to be different.
Yeah.
Did they struggle with infertility? Is that how they came to adoption?
Yes.
Yeah. So maybe that was the name they had picked out and they just wanted that name. And because Brian's a perfectly good name too. They could have just kept it Brian.
Yeah.
But a lot of adoptive parents change their kids' names. I changed our kid's name because he had a Japanese name and we made it his middle name. But yeah, it's like we can just take over and just change the name. Now that I think back, I'm like, well, why did I do that? Maybe I should have put a little more thought into that. Yeah. I'm sure that doesn't feel good.
When I talk about these sort of things, the difference in adoption, I make a comparison to a blended family when you have a stepchild.
Yeah.
So the stepchild's name doesn't get changed. So the previous relationship with the mother and the father doesn't change. That still continues on.
It's not hidden. Right.
This is about the care and provision for the child, not in relation to the adult's needs. And there's a very, very big difference in that.
Yeah. Adoption is about what do the adoptive parents want? And not so much considering the kid, because especially your age, when they were adopting in the 70s and 60s, there was a blank slate model. They're like, okay, take this kid home.
Yeah.
They're literally a blank slate. That's what the parents were told, as I understand it. Literally, you're starting as if they're your kid. And I think we're getting the hang of this now. I don't think parents are getting told that anymore. They're adopting now today, but it's still, I think, something that we adoptive parents and community members can really think about. Gosh, can we consider that this child already has a soul and a bunch of DNA and genetic propensities and memories and all sorts of things that we can honor and think about before we just trudge through there and change a whole bunch of stuff?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that comparison to a blended family or a step family, when I make that comparison to people, the penny drops. They go, oh, of course. Yeah.
Yeah. It makes good sense. I had never thought of that before either. And that does make good sense. Very good. Oh, we were working on your reunion. Did you find your birth parents?
Yes, I'll say I did the wrong thing by contacting my mother over the phone. So it was after many years of knowing where she was and finding out where she was. The irony is that she was the family genealogist and family historian.
Oh, wow.
And found her contact information via Ancestry in one of the blogs, looking at a collection of links in relation to historical family members. So on my mother's family side, we've got ancestors which go back to the First Fleet, first convicts within Australia.
Really?
So I was able to then find out her contact information there.
Wow, okay.
And rang her and said, "Hi, is this Judith?" And yes, who's this? And sorry, are you the daughter of Shirley and Stan? Yes, who are you? Well, it's your son Brian. She said, well, I don't have a son. I said, well, is this your date of birth, living in Sydney? I mean, she lives in Tasmania. And she said, well, I can't talk about it now. My husband's about to come home.
He doesn't know.
So then I recognised that the husband doesn't know. So I left it a while and then I rang her again and she said, well, I don't want to have any communication. And I said, well, can you explain to me why? Or can you just answer a few questions about who my father is, that type of thing? And she says, well, I thought you died.
Oh, because you were born so early. Oh, my gosh.
So the question, it wasn't clear in my mind, it wasn't clear in the communication whether she thought I died or whether she believed I died as someone had told her or whether she had made the assumption and hoped so.
Maybe that was easier to deal with, thinking that you were gone and grieving your death and thinking, oh, he's out there somewhere and I don't know where. And oh, wow.
That's right. So there's a very, very clear cutoff. So, obviously that wasn't what I wanted and I didn't quite know what to do or where to go from there.
So did you ever meet her or that just has never happened?
No, never
And
happened.
what about your birth father?
So I guess in relation to my mother, I had her email address and I sent her a couple of emails and we did have a bit of a conversation back and forth. Okay. But the reality is still that her husband doesn't know and she doesn't want him to know. So I sort of left that there to a certain degree.
Wow.
So then legislation changed in Australia that we were able to then obtain what's called putative father details, so the father that was named in the adoption records.
Okay.
So that changed and you have to sign a statutory declaration that you won't make contact with him or any family members.
Well, why would you be looking for the name if you don't want to make contact?
It doesn't make sense. That's right.
No. So you just have to wink and say, yeah, I'm not going to use this information for anything and just do it anyway.
Well, I hear what you're saying, but the reality is the possibility of 6 months jail or $10,000 fine.
Holy cow.
So, of course, that's going to scare people off, possibly even going down that avenue, finding the father's name and then not making contact. So this is where it gets a little bit hairy. This is where DNA comes in. So this is obviously many in the community have done DNA. And there's one problem that a lot of people don't recognise. There's the possibility that the name on the original documentation is incorrect.
On the birth certificate.
On the birth certificate or within the adoption papers. So if there's a fraudulent or illegal adoption, the father's name may be incorrect or it may be a different name or it may be a made-up name.
Ooh.
And in turn, I've also known where mothers have used a different name or the staff have put in a different name for the child and the mother on the documentation.
I've heard that before. And sometimes I've heard they put the wrong birth date. So you can go searching for birth date, but they've changed it so you can't find it.
Exactly. Or a slightly different spelling of a name. So instead of Mark, M-A-R-K, they do M-A-R-C. You know what I mean? So something very subtle, but enough to put a spanner in the works in relation to searching for documents.
And so that's what happened to you. You tried to find your father, but...
Well, I did go back to my mum to give her the benefit of the doubt and say, well, I'm doing DNA now. I've got the name. I'm going to do a search, just saying this is where I'm at. So she could prepare herself because my concern was that I had no understanding or no knowledge of their relationship other than anything negative. She didn't wish to disclose anything to me. Okay. So I wanted to protect her as well.
Sure.
And she then said, well, the name is just a name of a friend and he's not your father anyway. So, okay, here we go. So where do I go from now? So unfortunately, the process is set in a way that the only option I had then was to do a search for the name that was on the records. I'd contacted the Post-Adoption Resource Centre previously, and I had counselling with them over quite a few years. And this is sort of coming up around 1997, 2000, another decade later to a degree. And because they had also then spoken to my mother as well, they believed it was a conflict of interest for them to outreach to my father. So we had to go from then to the government department to do the outreach. And the outreach to him was negative. There was a negative response.
Oh, he didn't want to meet with you, or they couldn't find him?
Well, there's 3 men within Australia with the same name, and it was a negative no contact from all of them. And so I was like, okay, well, where do we go from here? Because even though I was told that, well, that's not his name and that's not the father, and I asked the government official, what if someone's saying, well, I don't want contacts? Okay, well, obviously that must be him if the details match. It's like, okay, well, there's nothing I can do about that. Yeah. So I thought, what the hell, I'll do DNA. And with doing DNA, many people would know the details or the match goes live. And I wasn't expecting any matches, and I was more thinking along the line that I would get recognition of sort of ancestry, that type of thing.
Oh, okay.
But I was shocked and surprised as an understatement to get a whole collection of matches. And because I understand the level of centimorgans and what each relationship was from the centimorgans, I had first cousins, so I also had aunties.
Oh, that's very close. That doesn't usually happen.
Yeah, on my father's side. So looking at information that I could see online, the man that was named on the documentation was my father.
Oh, so your mom was sending you on a wild goose chase.
Yeah, exactly. And the problem with that, even though I only mentioned that in a very small recount, that extended the search for years.
I bet.
For that process to go that next step, that extended for multiple years to then have the courage to take the next step. And then with DNA getting the matches, so it's like, oh, wow, okay, this information's all there and it's just sort of sitting in front of me. And from going from basically zero information to a massive information is really, really overwhelming.
Yeah, I bet.
And to recognise that, wow, okay, well, you do match with people. In one sense, you then go, oh, well, I actually exist.
Yeah. Yeah, that part's got to feel good.
So I have no words to describe it. I have words to describe most things, but I don't have any words to describe that feeling. And then I got a message. It was from my auntie, my paternal auntie, obviously. And she said, oh, we've got a lot of matches, so please contact me. It'd be great to connect with you. And I didn't sleep that night.
I bet.
And then I got out of bed the next morning and I looked at the messages again and there was another message from her and said, please, please, please contact me. You're either a nephew or you're either a grandson.
Okay.
And it's like, okay, she knows and understands the DNA. She knows what this is about. This is my in. So this is my opportunity to contact her without any legal repercussions.
Oh, I see. So then you weren't going to get fined or going to jail for this.
Yeah.
God, that's such a drag that's on top of you. Okay, good. So she's contacting you. So you're totally innocent and no problem. Good.
Yes. So I messaged her back and said, well, I believe I'm a nephew and your brother is my father. So she was overjoyed. We conversed for a few days and in between here and there, she basically gave me the family history.
Okay.
She was one family historian within my father's family.
Okay. She was a historian. Wow.
So this is where it gets even more complex, if you can imagine. My father is one of 9 siblings.
Whoa.
And my auntie was the eldest female and he was the eldest male. So in relation to family dynamics, they both had a position of power of some sort or a position of deference within the family. So I finally made contact with him and his response was, well, I've never done a DNA test. How do I know?
Okay.
So he wasn't swimmingly open with the whole process. So
yeah, he was kind of wanting to push it away.
Yeah, so in between here and there, because the other level of complexity was that they live on the other side of the state. All of a sudden there's 9 siblings, but remember that each of those 9 siblings also have partners and also have children. So there's 43 first cousins on my father's side.
Oh, my God. So they all started coming out of the woodwork and wanting to get to know you?
Yeah, exactly. So there was a level of complexity there that sort of happened and unfortunately erupted over Facebook. Massive contact by family members. And this was before I'd even had contact with some of my sisters. So I found out that I had 4 sisters.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So that made it difficult for them, but also made it difficult for me. How do I manage all of a sudden this massive people calling me,
new people
calling me cousin and calling me brother?
Wow.
And things sort of stalled a little bit. And Peter said, okay, we need to take a step back a little bit and we need to get to know Michael. Everyone else was able to get to know him. And that's fine. And I'm glad that that was done. And we sort of talked over the phone, emails, and then there was FaceTime and videos, and got to meet my sisters and their partners and their kids and meet Peter and his wife. And we ended up travelling to the other side of the state and then meeting them.
Okay.
And it was unbelievable. And so there was continuing sort of communication over Facebook with my sisters and that type of thing, and with cousins and aunties and uncles. And there's a few different groups that they put me in the family groups, and they each of them in their own way sharing bits and pieces of their histories. I mean, some cousins weren't interested, and some uncles and aunties weren't necessarily interested in having made contact. The difficult thing was that Peter had always known that my mother was pregnant. Okay. And I also got documentation of him basically signing off for my adoption as well. And the problem was that he put across the story, he never knew.
Oh, so you have papers with his signature on it.
Yep.
Is it possible they were forged by someone in your birth mother's family? Or
No, this is a stat deck with a communication in relation to the government and also the payment of maintenance as well. So he paid child maintenance or support as well.
Oh, he paid child support.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a level of complexity to that. And so when I met family members and they said, Peter never knew, I said, I'm sorry, but that's not the case. And regardless of what you think of the situation, I'm not going to start any relationship with a lie, but he always knew. But that's up to him to, navigate that with and with himself. That's something he needs to resolve. But I'm not going to move forward with a lie.
Yeah.
Long and short of it then was, because I relayed that information, his wife then gave me an ultimatum, and it's you either talk to us and us alone or no one at all.
Whoa, so they didn't want you talking to the siblings?
Yeah, that's right, the siblings and the cousins.
And he couldn't even do that himself. He had to go through his wife to do it. Okay, great. So what did you do?
And then with that as well, his wife sent an abusive message to the aunt who contacted me via DNA and basically saying the problems that you brought to our family and you're no longer invited. Ooh. So I guess the reason why I'm sharing this is this also seems to be a common circumstance where there's a level of complexity and there's a level of difficulty in family relationships that we as adoptees have no concept of, because these families have been existing for decades before we even arrive.
Yeah, you don't know what the internal fights are, the continual things that you're kind of walking yourself into a hornet's nest sometimes, I bet.
Very much. So in between here and there, we shut doors, so to speak. And what I did say when this sort of came about, it's like, okay, so right now there's a bit of conflict. This will naturally dissipate of its own accord. And the reality is that the majority of the individuals who are contacting me, there's a process of attrition. They'll go back to their everyday lives. Right now, this is a really interesting story, but it doesn't crucially make a huge difference within their lives and within their relationships. Obviously, for my father, his wife, and my sisters, it's a huge, huge change. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I recognised that and said that to them. This will automatically dissipate. Mm-hmm. They sort of weren't having any of that. So they closed all communication, and in between here and there, I had one sister who still communicates with me and we still have a good relationship. So what I recognise in that as well is that her relationship with her family has changed, but her relationship with herself has also changed.
Okay, and she was willing to go against her whole family to stay connected with you because that connection was more important than continuing the lie or the whatever was happening over there.
Yeah. Wow. So very simply, she said to me, well, you haven't done anything wrong. And her really sort of gentle and caring outlook, of course she loves her parents and her sisters, but the simple communication and contact that we've had for each other over the last few years, well, it's been life-saving for me.
Yeah, that one. Just one. You just need one, right?
Yeah, I don't know what I'd do without her.
Wow, thank God she's there.
Yeah, it's interesting because she was also the eldest sibling. And I said, do you realise that you're no longer the eldest sibling? And she said, I never even thought of it. So I was very aware of the family dynamics and how each of my sisters would act and respond to another person within the family dynamic. It didn't go down well, obviously. But she didn't have that judgment or that perspective. We communicate a lot. So
That's so
messages,
great. I'm so
Instagram,
glad.
Facebook, and telephone calls and videos and this sort of thing. But
And the rest of them
I've
are
learned a lot from her journey as well. So she's been quite
Mm.
open with me how she's been affected. And of course, I'm there to also support her as well.
That's how it's supposed to be.
And in between here and there, hey, we'll see what happens.
Yeah. Sure. Each day, one day at a time, right?
Yeah.
Well, you've had so many people just fail you along the way. Government, and then your adoptive parents sound like they were just not there for you, and then your birth parents really weren't there for you. And how has all of that affected you as a parent when you have these girls that look like you? And how do you even know how to be a parent if you've had all this rejection and deceit?
I would probably say I was a bit of a helicopter parent.
You went the opposite.
worrying about them a lot. My girls are 18 and 22 now, but they're both strong, independent women.
Oh, I'm so glad.
And that's the sort of thing that I've tried to emphasise, that they need to stick to their guns and remember their boundaries and who they are and how valuable they are.
Nice. Boy, that takes a lot of personal growth to be able to turn your story around and create daughters that feel strong and confident in their own selves. I mean, that could have gone way differently.
Exactly.
If you hadn't done some work on yourself all along this journey. The thing about adoption that I am getting more and more every day is that it just cuts to the core of who you are. It's not something that's placed on top of you. We're talking about who you are.
Yeah.
And it affects every single thing in your whole life. Everything. I don't know what it's like in Australia, but I think here we're like, oh, well, you were adopted. It happened and that's it. And it probably was a good thing, because where would you be without this wonderful family, blah, blah, blah. But man, if we can just all become a little bit more aware of how it affects every single thing in your whole life.
Absolutely. I always talk about the language within adoption. So if someone says I was adopted, it actually does nothing to describe what actually happened to them. So
it was not a one-time thing.
Yeah, as a descriptor, the language within adoption is really problematic because it really isn't clear of describing what happened. So if I say I was adopted, what does that actually mean? There's a whole sequence of events that happened for me in that process in the past, but there's also a whole lot of processes and things that will happen to me throughout the entirety of my life.
They continue to happen, yeah. So, do you prefer I am adopted, or do you just not like that adopted word at all?
I say I was adopted, but even that, you say, yeah, I was adopted, but then the case is that I still am adopted and I'll always be adopted. And the only option of not being adopted technically is being unadopted by discharge. So we've got a lifelong contract on us that we never signed for.
Yeah.
So in the previous comparison with, say, a blended family, if you change the age or you change the individual within a structure, you see where the difficulties lie. So let's say if it was a 16-year-old girl and their name was being changed and they were moving to a different family and they had no longer a relationship with the previous family, they had to undertake a new identity without any recourse of getting out of that, that's akin to an old forced marriage. So those same structural elements are in play, but they're just named something differently. I guess another way of explaining this is the way language changes. So we used to say battle fatigue, and then we used to say shell shock, and now we say post-traumatic stress disorder for vets. So the language has changed, and it doesn't necessarily describe what actually happened to the individual. The language is a little bit removed.
Right. It sounds so clinical. But yeah, if you're living with PTSD, it's not just a thing you have. It is a thing that encompasses you, right? It feels like
that's exactly right. So I guess the difference between PTSD, where it can be one traumatic event, let's say a car accident or something like that, where complex post-traumatic stress disorder can be a collection of events over a duration or period of time. And I would say that the majority of adoptees do actually have the complex post-traumatic stress disorder, but it's not necessarily recognised because the premature maternal-infant separation isn't necessarily recognised as being traumatic. So we still have a hell of a way to go for even within the adoption community to actually understand that and the effects of that, and then even broader society. We've got even further to go for that to be recognised.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree with you. We've had psychiatrists say, oh, he was a baby when that happened. That doesn't affect anything. And he was majorly in crisis at the time. It would have been nice to have someone say, oh, maybe the CPTSD has affected you. Let's see if we can get you some trauma-informed therapy. No, that did not happen. just so much needs to be done. I understand Australia is doing amazing things for adoptees, and I understand that you are a piece of that. I don't exactly know what you're doing down there. So can you enlighten me and especially our US listeners, what you guys are up to in Australia?
I sort of came into this space about a decade ago, around about the federal apology. I went to a retreat organised by the Post-Adoption Resource Centre, which was a combination of adoptees specifically, but also there were some adoptees that were also mothers of loss to adoption as well.
Oh, okay. So birth mothers.
What I recognise within that, and what you briefly mentioned before, is that a lot of the conversation around adoption is normally talking about mother loss of the adoptee and, of course, the loss of the child by the mother, where the men in the equation, technically, there's not a lot of discussion or not a lot of research about. I've come to recognise that the loss of my mother was unbelievably devastating for me throughout my life. But now as a father, the loss of my father I recognise is so much damaging as well. Also, the lack of a relationship I had with my adoptive father.
Yeah, both of your fathers really were not there for you, huh?
Yeah, so the way I describe it to people is there's sort of two bookends. One bookend is normally the mother and one bookend is normally the father. And then the child is in between those two. And if there technically is an absent bookend or an absent parent, well, the child then goes off into broader society to try and get some form of response. And, of course, there can be a negative response. Society isn't kind and the government never makes a good caretaker. So I set up a Facebook group specifically for male adoptees. So I was interested in talking to other guys of how they manage, what they do and what works for them. And what I recognise also is with socialisation, the lack of communication. So I would say, generally speaking, that women are socialised to be more social than what men are, but to be socialised within groups, specifically to communicate, where men are socialised as individuals to perform actions, not necessarily communicate.
Yeah.
So talking about this big, deep, vulnerable stuff is a different discussion with guys than it is with the girls in the groups.
I bet. And
so that sort of got me interested. So that's why I reflected on this, where this has affected myself and what I see as the effect in others as well. In between here and there, sharing things over social media, communicating with people like yourself over social media, finding out what's going on in the world, and it was really eye-opening to me. In the first instance, it's like, wow, there's so much I don't know.
So the first time you got connected with other adoptees and kind of got into the adoption space, was it like, whoa, there are the people that have the same sort of experiences as me?
Exactly, and understanding the history and understanding the politics. So that's also another thing as well. What I've recognised is that depending on the personality or the perspective of the individual, we gravitate to something which is meaningful or understandable to us. So one person will say it's the legal architecture, it's the system that needs to change, and that's where their focus lies. Where another person will say, well, it's the healing of the individual, it's the internal stuff that needs to be looked at, and that's where their focus lies. So it's like each of these pieces out of the pie have a slightly different flavour, but the end result is the same pie.
Yeah, they're all working for the same thing. And what piece of the pie do you fit in?
Good question. I don't know. A little bit of everything. Yes, I like to help other people and advocate for them and share information. So that's always my big thing of raising awareness and raising understanding. But having those deep conversations one-on-one for me is what I found really worthwhile as well.
Nice.
Because you're able to bypass some of the stuff and get into the deep pieces that we need to look at. It's not necessarily easy, but I think it's extremely crucial.
Yeah, definitely. Very, very crucial. Can you explain the federal apology to us? And did it affect you directly?
It did. It really affected me because the federal apology was given by Prime Minister Julia Gillard in 2013. Okay. So that was a product of the Senate report. And
the product of who?
The Senate report. So a governmental report into the historical forced adoption practices.
Okay.
So we've had a collection of apologies throughout Australia and each of the states, but then finally getting a federal apology. For me, it came at that time when I was dipping my toe in this and going, okay, I really need to unpack this and get a handle on it and get on top of it. And personally, it was like I could point to something outside of myself and say, here's an apology. This is the Prime Minister. That is a recognition for me that what I think and feel is actually real. So it was the first time I could point to something outside of myself where someone was saying that what's happened to you hasn't happened and, yes, it's not a good thing, as opposed to the dominant narrative.
Yeah, you felt validated. I wish we would do something like that. I know that Australia has a bad history of taking Aboriginal children. Is that the right word? And is that primarily what the forced adoptions were referring to, or are they just talking about adoption in general, where there's coercion involved?
Adoption in general, where with the Indigenous population, the Aboriginal population, you've got what's called the Bring Them Home report. And then from that, you've got the term the stolen generations. Okay. Yeah, I'm not an expert in that area. But the thing across all of this, though, is that we have an apology for child migrants coming from the UK, coming into Australia, children that were brought over and then institutionalised. And then you've also got the apology for the sex abuse within institutions. Oh. You've also got an apology for what's called forgotten Australians, so that's kids that spent time in care. All of these apologies have been enacted on children. They're all different demographics or cohorts, but if you look at the similarity, the removalist practice and policy has happened across the entirety of society. So the majority population within Australia have no concept or no idea that there was forced adoption or even a forced adoption apology. So the general population is like, it was the mores of the day and this is what happened and, well, we don't do that now. But the reality is that, unfortunately, it also still happens. Yeah. With the previous discussion with language, even the term forced adoption, now, unfortunately, that is being used in cases where children are being removed because of mental health or drug use or whatever the case may be. So what happens then is that because that term is used now in a slightly different meaning, I'm of the mind that it sort of invalidates its previous use, but it invalidates the previous conversation that women have been having for the last 40 or 50 years, the mothers that have been having the conversation about having their children removed. This term has now been, for want of a better term, watered down. Oh, I see. Language is really important. The understanding is really important to know where we're at as a culture and as a nation as well. Well, that's what I'm here for at Unraveling Adoption. I'm trying to unravel all of these complexities and get people to really, really think about what we're doing out there and take action whenever we can. If we have any sort of angle we can take action with. And it sounds like you're doing that. You're involved with some government advocacy and one-on-one with your peers. And I think you're doing really great work. And I know that you are a writer and that writing has helped you. I'm going to guess that writing has helped you tremendously to process all of this roller coaster ride you've been on of identity and search and reunion. Am I right that the writing has been helpful for you? Your writing's been really helpful. I came to the conclusion that I don't have the capacity to sit down and do a PhD. So how else do I communicate this? But I communicate this in a way that people understand it. And, well, for me, it's creative writing and specifically poetry. Very much processing what's happened and trying to get a better understanding, but really trying to illustrate to listeners or readers the level of complexity of this. It's a daily thing. You write daily, like it's a practice? The complexities are daily. There's a daily reminder. As an example, you turn on the television and most stories are on. It's either about a family or someone finding family or a loss of family. So if we look at popular media, you think Harry Potter, you think Superman, you think Batman. So there's all these archetypal stories which at the core of them have family or the loss of a family member. So there's a continual recognition of this on some level within society, but I think because it's, to a certain degree, it's such a taboo subject, the idea of losing a family member is so fundamentally traumatic that we can only manage this through creative endeavours. Okay. So if it's fictional, we can deal with it. Exactly. Oh, interesting. Are you willing and interested in sharing your poem that I love so much and that's so sad? I would love the listeners to hear it. Yeah. I guess for me, it's the difficulties in relation to reunion. Reunion also doesn't solve things. It adds a level of complexity to whatever's happening in your life. And there's no other way of saying that. So
so don't go into reunion thinking it will fix your mental health, or it'll probably make things more complicated.
Exactly. Yeah, there's no way to describe it. All right, so this is basically a reflection on that, and more so for me, the failure of reunion. So the poem's called Goodbye, ! Hello, ? We never got to say hello before you said goodbye. We never got to live in truth before you lived a lie. Decades long of searching have been my life's refrain, and when I finally found you, you were simply gone again. The child that was unwanted, forsaken and denied, disallowed a mother's love or a father's pride. Sorrow stained and broken down, moored in a sea of pain, left to drift as dead, clinging to my mother's name. You chose to quickly flee and deny your promises, pack them amongst your things and left everything unsaid. What you failed to understand, to fathom or to see, was that you left your son behind with a pain mythology. The story I was given and so adamantly told was part of the exchange with what was bought and sold. This never settled with me because it wasn't true. It left me with a heart of hurt because there wasn't you. My role was now a product to fill a social need, to hide a bastard born and an infertility. A mother's not replaceable, and neither is a son. A father's not exchangeable, or maybe I am wrong. It's pretty tough going. I'm trying to explain what that means in relation to the failure of reunion. So I recognise in myself that for many years, I can't think of another term, but I've held a flame for my mother and father, which I think is normal and natural.
I'm sure. Yes. Yeah. There's a genetic pull. I think it's absolutely normal.
Yeah.
And just very sad. Your story is sad. There's not like a happy ending we're going to have here, folks. I'm so moved by your story because you are open and you're sharing it to help other people. And you're a very, very nice guy. And you have every right in the world to just be a really mean, bad person from all of the stuff that's happened to you. But you have flipped your script and decided to be helpful to others and to find your own meaning in your life. And I admire that so greatly.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, let's give people a little bit of hope. Besides the writing, what other tools have you found to be useful that have kept you afloat all this time through all these difficulties?
A bit of a mixed bag of tools and tricks. Meditation. If you want to look at researchers looking at the works of Peter Levine, Gabor Mate, Stephen Porges. So really focusing in on the reality of your own biology. So what is your body saying? What is your mental landscape like? What are your thoughts and feelings saying? And start from there. And the first thing I would say to start is with the breath, and that's with meditation. I recognise that would also be absolutely terrifying for many people because to experience a sense of stillness maybe for the first time in their life, if they've had a life of hypervigilance, is very disquieting. And that was certainly the case for me when I started doing meditation. I'd sort of couple that with body work, so massage or physio to deal with the muscle restriction and fibromyalgia. So it depends on what sort of symptomology that you may have, but starting very much with what's going on with the body, I would say that any way that we respond is, and I think this is really crucial to understand, is actually normal. It's a normal response to a highly abnormal event.
Yes.
So there's no more abnormal event than the removal of an infant and its mother. And I always do a comparison and get people to think of, say, kittens and puppies. There's legislation around weaning them at a certain period of time, and that's the biological necessity of the communication between the mother and the offspring. So there's a biological loop in us that is not completed, likewise in the mother as well.
Yes.
So I think what that then presents as attachment trauma.
Yep.
So we're continually trying to attach and attach and attach through any and every relationship that we have.
So relationships can get really muddy.
Yeah. And I mean, more than not, this is unconscious stuff.
Yes.
You may be subtly aware of it, but recognizing that desire and that need to be connected with the other person. So then if you've got a level of codependency with the other individual and with you giving yourself away. So I think for many adoptees, I've recognized that if you say, well, what do you think? And they go, I don't know. What do you feel? I don't know.
Yeah.
And it's not that they don't know, it's that they haven't actually been asked the question of what they think and what they feel, and they haven't actually sat with what they think and what they feel for a long enough period of time, because that's looking in the abyss, that sense of stillness. So that then comes back to why meditation is also really, really difficult. But I would say it's really, really crucial.
Did you start it when it was so difficult at the beginning? Did you just like 1 minute or?
Oh, yeah, even that 1 minute. Yeah. I wouldn't necessarily advise for everyone to do this, but for me it was doing 10-day silent retreats for Vipassana meditation.
Oh, wow.
And that was like taking your car into the garage and ripping the motor out. that was the absolute
that's extreme.
Yeah. So,
but it helped you a lot?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
But not everybody would be able to function after that. That's pretty intense.
Yeah.
Wow.
So I think simple things like emotions are held in the stomach very much. Mm-hmm. So hot water bottle on the stomach. And agitation and issues with sleep, try a weighted blanket. And depending on how comfortable we are with change of temperatures, ice baths, warm spas, saunas and ice baths. So you're coming back to changing the response within the neurology, within the biology of the body.
The body. It's in the body.
And that's where you've got to start. And then you build a foundation from that.
Yeah. I have been really digging deep into studying trauma. I love the 3 authors you mentioned, Peter Levine, Gabor Mate, Stephen Porges, and I'll list some of their books in the notes. And I always thought you could just talk it through, like just keep going to therapy, keep talking about it, and eventually it will work out. But no. It's not in your frontal lobe. It's deep, deep into your cells in your body. And it's much harder to find and get to, but it's worth it if you're willing.
Yeah, so, I mean, there's a difference between the mammalian brain and the reptilian brain. So the issue with the adoptees is the amygdala comes online too early. So our whole body systems are activated at a premature age. So if you extrapolate that, that's how you get the hypervigilance. So if you think of it as an alarm system, so the alarm system is going, mind you, the alarm system's going, but we no longer hear the alarm. We no longer see the flashing lights. We know that there's an alarm going off, but we don't know what the threat actually is. The threat is just internalized, and we just have a feeling, sort of wading through the murkiness of that feeling, and then coming to have a relationship with your own body and have a relationship to your thoughts and feelings.
Yeah. Well, thank you for bringing all that to our attention. I think those are really great things to think about, and adoptees that are listening or adoptive parents that have adopted kids that might be looking for this. You can start this kind of stuff, the weighted blanket and the play therapy. And there's all sorts of things you can do with your kids really young. So I wish I would have done a bunch of this stuff, because my son is paying for it dearly with the impulsive behavior and addiction and suicidality. I mean, it's no joke. It's so difficult just existing for him. And I feel his pain, and I wish I would have done a bunch of stuff sooner. So if any of you are listening and have little kids, get in there. Get in there and help them, because they're already feeling it, right?
Absolutely.
From the moment they're separated, they're going to feel it.
And I guess the thing is, they don't have the vocabulary to express what they're feeling. And as an adult now, I have the vocabulary to be able to express what my thoughts and feelings are, even today. But I can reflect on what happened to me as a child and how that made me feel. Any intervention that's put in at an early age, you won't see the dividends in the first instance. Yeah. It's an accumulative thing over a period of time.
Yeah. You'll probably never know what it would have been like. I mean, you just go one direction and it takes you, but gosh, do whatever we can to help our adopted kids. It's just such a struggle, And I think your story really helps us just realize how total it is. It affects every single thing about you. And I think your story expresses that very, very well. And it's a very sad story, and I'm very grateful for you to share it. I know how much emotional energy it takes to share your story and sit here and talk about it for an hour, so appreciate it. And I believe that you also feel that you're sharing your story will help a lot of other people.
I hope so. I mean, if someone hears something within what I've said that they can relate to and go, okay, I understand myself a bit better. I understand this situation a little bit better. I have a tool now, or I have something I can reflect on in a slightly different. Yeah, every time anyone tells their story and recounts what's going on, they help them reprocess that and come to a better place.
Helps you and it helps other people. Yeah, doing this podcast certainly helps me greatly. And it helps my son, even though he's not involved in it immediately right now. It's helping him knowing that our family's story is helping other people. So it's kind of therapeutic. And I will put a link to your beautiful and sad poem and your other writing. But is there a way you want people to get a hold of you?
Sure. Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter. So I'm on all of those accounts, and that's not a problem. Please reach out and say hello.
Okay, I'll put all those links in the show notes. They're underneath or to the side of your audio feed. You'll find all the notes. I've got lots of links and interesting things for you. And I put links to all the things that Michael mentioned throughout the show. So, well, thank you very much, Michael. I'm very honored that you're sharing your story from around the world. And please, listeners, share this important story with others you think that would be willing to listen and be open to what we have to say. And find Unraveling Adoption on social media and on YouTube. And we have a website, unravelingadoption.com. I have an adoptive parent group called Aptitude. If any adoptive or foster parents would like to dig in with me and face adoptions challenges together, you can find more information at unravelingadoption.com/aptitude. Thank you, Michael. And Michael and I want you all to stay safe.